All right, we're starting the Q&A. So raise your hands and I will come around to you. Perfect, first one.
I'm so glad to get a chance to speak to everyone here for the first time. No, I'll seriously take 2 seconds, but I have to make sure that these questions are asked of you. They're the most important ones, and then I'll let them all put you to the fire.
All right.
Do you really have a $400 bet with Ben that Trump would win in 2016?
Well, no, I had a $100 bet with Ben, and he gave me odds because he was so confident. And then when President Covfefe did make it across the finish line, I had to shake him down by his ankles, and I now have it framed on my set every single day. It's a beautiful thing.
Fantastic. Continuing with the speed round. What is your Myers-Briggs personality type?
I took one of these. I am an ENTJ, I think.
I guessed it right. It's on the paper, and you'll see it in a
Really?
second. Yeah. Look at this.
No.
I was right.
No. Hey,
Yeah,
you got it.
I think you're ENTJ.
You nailed it. Now, what's my horoscope sign? What's my rise? You know, Mercury's in retrograde. What do you know? No, we'll talk about it later.
Those don't exist. Was it scary hosting Jordan B. Peterson on your show, and did you clean your room afterwards?
I never clean my room, though I do like Jordan very much. What was difficult with Jordan is it's very difficult to get Jordan to laugh, and I have made it a mission in life to make Jordan Peterson laugh. And I got like half of a chuckle once, which I took as a great victory. But that can be a little intimidating. You're trying to tell jokes, and he's just like, you know.
He is
Clean
as
your
serious
room,
as
Michael.
he
I know
can.
you haven't. Be like a lobster. Yeah.
You often mention your lovely little Elisa on your
Yes.
podcast. How do you annoy her most, and how do you make up for it?
Well, I think that probably contributes to annoying her most, you know, constantly referring to sweet little Elisa on the podcast. She's not a big fan of the cigars, and I smoke about 150,000 cigars per day. But, you know, sweet little Elisa is like a true saint and a martyr, and she's taken it upon herself to try to make me live, you know, for a little bit longer in this world, pull me out of the gutter, you know, just there slobbering to myself in booze and stogies. And so I think she takes that suffering as a sanctifying experience.
And finally, what color is Covfefe?
Oh, that's an excellent question, but if you don't know, I couldn't possibly tell you. Sorry.
I was hoping you would reveal yourself. That's all right.
Next question.
Thank you. You mentioned earlier Bill Clinton, and you mentioned that Bill Clinton was a rapist, and
He
I
still
think
is.
I'm not saying he's not. And I think that you drew an equivalence between Bill Clinton and Donald Trump. Have you considered maybe they are both very bad?
Well, I certainly compared the two men. I've spoken to one of Bill Clinton's victims. I've spoken to Juanita Broaddrick at length, and I believe her. I do. This is not to say there can be plenty of false accusations. People do it all the time. There have been many of these instances on college campuses in the last 5 years. But I believe Juanita Broaddrick, and I've seen a lot of scandals and ginned up scandals around Donald Trump. Does Donald Trump have an unchivalrous way with women? I don't think anyone on planet Earth would disagree with that. But I haven't seen accusations with the seriousness and persistence of those accusations against Bill Clinton and the ways in which he did it and the places in which he did it and the abuses of power that were involved in his doing it and the abuses of the public trust that were entailed in Bill Clinton's exploits. I haven't seen any of that with Donald Trump. That's not to say that Donald Trump is a monk or a saint or, you know, even a well-behaved guy when it comes to those sorts of things, but I don't think they're on the same level. I don't see evidence of that. If someone presented me evidence with that, I would consider it.
Hi. So given the success that Trump has had on social media in the 2016 campaign and now with all the scrutiny on these platforms, how do you see the online landscape changing in terms of the 2018 and even 2020 campaigns?
They're trying to shut us down. That is what is happening. The mainstream media were able to shut conservatives out for 70 years. They were able to kick us off of television, boot us out of Hollywood studios, and finally the internet happened, and we killed it, man. The conservatives are so much better at the internet. We're bigger, faster, funnier. It is, all the good memes are conservatives. The blank book thing happened because conservatives are very clever online. It's not me. I told a very simple joke, and then all of these conservatives started leaving 10-paragraph reviews citing Sophocles and Thucydides, and it was very, very funny. The wit is all there. And conservatives have used social media very effectively since the beginning. Donald Trump used it much better than Hillary Clinton did. By the way, when Barack Obama was perhaps misusing data on Facebook at a much higher rate, by the way, than this mostly made-up Cambridge Analytica scandal, when Barack Obama was stealing the data or using the data without consent of 190 million Americans compared to, at high estimates, 70 to 80 million Americans, as happened with Cambridge Analytica for a variety of other candidates. When Obama did that, the mainstream media said, he's the digital candidate. He's the candidate of youth. Good for him. What a genius. And the Obama campaign, by the way, admitted, they came out, they said, using data from Facebook without people's consent was a game changer. It was the most important technology we used in that campaign. And the media, they celebrated it. Then Donald Trump gets good at social media, and it is a crime with testimony and investigations and wailing and gnashing of teeth. It's absurd, and they're out for blood. This is why they're dragging Mark Zuckerberg over this complete non-controversy, this ridiculous made-up scandal. They're dragging him here because conservatives used it to win. They're going to keep trying to censor us. They censor many of my videos, if not most of them, on YouTube, because I'm such an intimidating guy, as you can tell. They shadow ban conservatives. We've seen that on tape. They've admitted to it, and they're going to keep doing it. And then we're going to have to find another venue because their first instinct is to censor, and ours is to let freedom reign because that we know in a free exchange of ideas we're going to win. Thanks.
Hey, Michael, love your show.
Thanks.
What's the risk of Trump being primaried by, say, like a Flake or a Corker in 2020?
Well, are Flake and Corker going to run in the Democrat primary, or are they going to run in the Republican primary? All I ever see from those guys is them complaining about and criticizing Republicans. With Republicans like them, who needs Democrats? I don't think they pose any threat whatsoever. If there were a serious politician, a respectable conviction candidate, somebody like Ted Cruz, for example, to primary Donald Trump, I think you'd have some trouble there because you have a conviction, you have something you believe. But if it's just whiny little opportunists who are upset that the president was mean to them and they might not win re-election, I don't think they'll pose any threat at all.
Hi, Michael. In your lecture, you mentioned Trump's non-interventionist foreign policy promises. Last week, we saw the Syria strike. Do you see that as Trump reneging on his promises, and what do you think the implications of that strike are, like just for foreign policy in general?
I don't think it's reneging on his promises because I don't think he promised non-intervention or isolation. Conservatives, we want to be so extreme. We want it one way or the other. We either want to bomb every country on earth or we want to, retreat into our bunkers and eat meals ready to eat and just keep our guns by our pillows or something. And I think Donald Trump, being pragmatic and being a pragmatist, says we are going to intervene in some cases when the costs are relatively low and the benefits are relatively better, the art of the deal when it involves shooting missiles into Syria. And in other cases, we're not going to do that, and we're going to try to have strategic goals. So with Barack Obama, he invented red lines out of whole cloth. And then what was so awful about that, regardless of what you think about intervening in the Syrian civil war, is that he refused to back up his words. So the credibility of the United States looked like it was worthless. And here, fortunately, with Donald Trump, we have him backing up American credibility abroad, but without a terrible cost. So we say these weapons are prohibited, they violate international norms, they violate the policy of the United States. We're not going to permit that. It looks to me, if I had to guess, like a foreign policy of mowing the lawn, We don't have to go and invade every country on Earth, but when those weeds get a little high, you got to mow them with some cruise missiles or something like that. That seems perfectly fine. People caricature Trump's national security advisor, John Bolton, a very brilliant man. They try to caricature him as someone who all he wants to do is bomb everyone else in the world. But Ambassador Bolton has been fairly clear about Syria and said Syria is not the strategic central question to the world order or in American foreign policy. There are other places, and we need to balance the risks and rewards as they come. That's not a clear foreign policy. That isn't all one way or the other. But as Dr. Johnson pointed out, all shallows are clear.
Thank you for your show. Awesome. Big fan.
Thank you very much.
Especially, it's a nice break from Ben's show.
Well, Ben, he talks like 400 words a minute, so I have to. For other podcasts, I speed them up 2x, and for Ben, I slow it down.
I slow it down, yeah.
50%, yeah.
Yeah, and I find I get a little angry. Like, I love Ben; he's an awesome guy, but like, he's just so serious. So, like, watching a show where you laugh and Clavin's show too is a nice change.
You got to listen to Ben's first because you'll get like all the news, and you'll just think like, this world is about to explode, man. Then hopefully it gets a little lighter in Covfefe.
Yeah. So for my question, I saw Andrew's talk at UT Austin, and he talked a lot about the culture and talked a lot about how there were a lot of questions about how conservatives can kind of infiltrate the culture and the media and create art that changes society, that changes the culture. And I think over these past 10 years, there's been a radical change. And now you have people like Crowder, you have CRTV, you have the Daily Wire. Where people are just creating a lot of great content. So, moving ahead, where do you, someone who has a background in theater, where do you see those big cultural changes on the right, happening in terms of art, in terms of media, in terms of, I guess just changing. I don't know if that
changing the culture and changing it to affect politics. It's very heartening because as a conservative who's I've been in lots of I won't even call them C-list films. I'll call them like H-list films, that air on channel 3000 at 2 in the morning or something. But as a result of that, I've been around a lot of conservatives in show business in New York and Hollywood, and we're a much beleaguered group, not just because it's difficult and conservatives get blacklisted from the major studios and the major programs and the major publishing institutions, but because conservatives themselves don't want to consume the culture. Drew points this out a lot, that conservatives are often Philistines, and they don't want to read novels, and they don't want to listen to audiobooks, and they don't want to go see the movies. So one aspect of hope, you bring up Crowder, you bring up all of these podcasts, these guys are breaking through. Crowder would never be hired by Saturday Night Live, right? They wouldn't put him on The Daily Show, even though he's way funnier than any of those guys. But they refuse to do that because the left gets so complacent. It's the same thing as being a conservative in a left-wing culture on campus. It makes you much smarter. It makes you have better arguments because you constantly have to defend what you think and refine what you think because maybe the 97% of lefties around you on campus or in Hollywood or in New York, they'll point out a flaw in your argument. And then you'll have a stronger argument. You'll find out what you really believe. They never have that opportunity. So what the left is doing is they're using all the old technology. They're fighting the last war. They got so complacent that they make big movies and that don't make any money, of course, but they still make them somehow, and TV and publishing and blah, blah, blah. But conservatives, we've been forced to innovate. So we're much sharper on the internet. We're making shows and programs for shoestring budgets. My own little plug is I did a narrative podcast with Andrew Clavin, which is, he wrote a story called Another Kingdom, and I performed all of the roles. And I can attest that it was a shoestring budget, unfortunately. Very, very shoestring. But as a result, we were able to put out a very popular piece of conservative culture for relatively nothing. Those gatekeepers can't hold us back anymore. And it's the place you will find it is where the gatekeepers haven't shown up yet. And our goal is we have to keep those gatekeepers away as long as we can. And then we'll move on to something else. Absolutely not. Yeah, you bet.
Awesome. So do you see that as more, right now, obviously there's a lot of subscription-based, sites like The Blaze and CRTV and Daily Wire. Do you see it more as following in that subscription model? Do you think that there's going to be, I hear people talk about a platform to rival YouTube? or something like that? Do you think it's going to consolidate? Do you have any thoughts on that?
It would be hard for conservatives to make our own YouTube. I wish we would do it. I think it would be great because they wouldn't censor my videos where I talk to authors or whatever and they say, this is too dangerous. They wouldn't censor Dennis Prager explaining why you shouldn't murder people. Do not murder. That was censored by YouTube because Dennis Prager was explaining a commandment. So I would prefer that. I suspect it would ghettoize us. I suspect the people who are politically tuned in and really view things in a philosophical or ideological way, there aren't that many of us, and of conservatives, that are probably half of those people, and it would just probably not work. The reason that YouTube works is that everybody's on YouTube. The reason that Twitter works is that everybody's on Twitter, even though they keep kicking all of us off Twitter, but there's still a lot of people there. I suspect that, unfortunately, won't happen. So I think what we have to do is be the subversive ones. We in the culture now, we on the right, are the subversive ones. The stodgy, old, decrepit, corrupt establishment is a left-wing establishment. We get to subvert, and I think we should subvert on their own platforms. And I think we should keep doing it and doing it until another one pops up. And I don't think we should cede that field to them at all and try to ghettoize ourselves. We got to crack it from within.
Thank you. So what about the wall?
You're telling me. You're telling me, man. It's been a little... You don't want the wall. You do want I want the wall too. I know. We need to do the wall. It's become very frustrating because this seems like a simple enough matter, doesn't it? But it's going to be held up forever. And that shows us two things. It shows us, one, how people on the right and Republicans usually don't really mean what they say. They say one thing. They say, we're going to repeal Obamacare, repeal Obamacare, repeal Obamacare. And then they say, okay, now you can do it. So, I didn't say I wanted to repeal Obamacare. I thought. And we're seeing this a little bit on the wall, too. What it also shows us is that the federal bureaucracy is far too large and has far too much power. I had the privilege of speaking with Justice Scalia twice before he died. And we asked him what the greatest threat to the republic is and threat to American liberty. He said it's the unaccountable bureaucracy that can hold up the wall construction because of, the spotted salamander that hops across the Rio Grande, and that's why we can't protect our sovereign country and we can't enforce democratically enacted immigration laws. Nevertheless, I think we're going to keep pushing here, and one aspect of Donald Trump that took me a while to appreciate is that he makes these outrageous claims, or he pushes very, very far to push you beyond the sale. Scott Adams, the Dilbert guy, brought my attention to this, that he'll say, we're going to build the wall and Mexico's going to pay for it. And then all of a sudden everyone's arguing about who's going to pay for the wall, but you've already accepted the premise that we're going to have a wall, right? That would have been unthinkable even a few years ago. So I am holding out some hope for the art of the deal, and maybe in my glass half full way, Donald Trump is saving the wall so that we have to re-elect him. Knock on wood. I'm unfortunately skeptical. Trust but verify was Reagan's line, but hopefully it will happen eventually because it's important symbolically and it's important practically. Walls work. There are walls all around this building. There are walls in this classroom, and we ought to have walls to protect our country as well.
Hello, thank you for coming here. I'm from former Soviet Union, as you can tell by my accent. And when I came here 20 years ago, it was a complete shock to me that leftist ideas are very popular here. And left is basically poisoning kids in schools and colleges. And you mentioned Dennis Prager, and he saved me after Obama was elected second time. He was talking about 5 stages of grief, and it was exactly like was my experience. So anyway, my question is, what is your opinion about conservative radio? And also, I would recommend all young people to listen to conservative radio. And who is your favorite talk show host?
There are too many to count. Rush is the original one. But thank you so much for mentioning that you're from the Soviet Union and you're horrified by the evils of leftism and of totalitarianism. Because I didn't live in the Soviet Union forever, but I did visit Cuba briefly over the summer. And the first thing I noticed there is that people don't wear Che Guevara t-shirts in Cuba. The Cubans don't wear them. White liberals wear them in the United States. White useful idiots in America wear Che Guevara t-shirts because they don't know the horrors of enslavement and property confiscation and physically being brutalized by the government. They don't know what that's like. They would deny, I think, the reality of those things. What they wear in Cuba are American flags. I saw it a dozen times in just a few days, sewn onto jeans, on their little bicycles, on the few meager pieces of property that they're allowed to have without it being confiscated. It's so important. And your point on conservative talk radio gets back to something that I brought up a little earlier. You know, I love Dennis Prager. Dennis is my cigar buddy. We're very fortunate to have him in Los Angeles. And sometimes the sophisticates, the academic types, they say, oh, how can you listen to conservative talk radio? They take complex ideas and boil them down and make them so simple. Dennis Prager is a very, very intelligent guy, and he has an amazing gift to boil down complex things and go piece by piece and make them digestible to a mass audience. That is a wonderful thing. There should be no snobbishness here. There should be no nose in the air, you know, trying to sip your Chablis or something like that. These are real problems, and I fear that people who grew up in privilege, ironically, it's all the people yelling at us about our privilege that are the ones that have had privilege destroy their minds and distort their vision. People who have grown up in privilege, they don't understand how brutal the conclusion of leftist ideas can really be, and I hope that conservative talk radio helps, but I also hope that people like you who have seen it firsthand, who have experienced it, can talk up and tell them what you've seen and explain reality to these people. It's a very important thing, and it's an irony.
When they're like willing to listen. But some people say, oh, no, it just happened there, it never happened here, and they don't understand that this is utopia, which kills people, literally kills. It's not just making people poor, it just socialism kills.
It does. Utopia kills. People think utopia means the best place. That's what they think the word means. It doesn't. It means no place. That's what the word, it means no place. It doesn't exist. It's a fantasy. Democrat politicians used to frequently quote a line from George Bernard Shaw. They would say, some people see things that are and ask why, but I dream things that never were and ask why not. And they say this as though it's some uplifting, inspirational quote. What they fail to mention, because they don't read beyond the quote book, is that it wasn't George Bernard Shaw who said that. It was George Bernard Shaw writing in the mouth of the serpent tempting Eve in the play Back to Methuselah. Those are the words of the devil, and that utopian vision, it leads to very, very dark places. We've seen it for so long, well over a century, and unfortunately people seem to forget, and what is that they tell you? When you forget history and you don't learn from the past, you're doomed to repeat it, sadly.
Hi, Michael. How much would you estimate that the deep state has over the U.S. domestic and foreign policy right now, given the raid on Trump's office in his personal term?
So to use the term, because I think a lot of conservatives, they think that we're talking about some crazy conspiracy thing when we use the term the deep state. All the deep state means is the entrenched bureaucracy that has no democratic accountability. We, the people, have not put them there. They're the lifers in D.C. who construct an inordinate amount of our public policy and really have an inordinate impact on our political lives and the way that we're governed. The deep state, or the federal bureaucracy, has grown so enormously, you don't even need to see
intelligence agencies.
And the intelligence agencies are a part of that. You know, it's funny because people have these images of like all of government is just this awful bureau where people like aren't that efficient and they always bungle things. But then they have this image of the CIA or something as this amazingly effective organization, you know, and they're like Jack Bauer or whatever, you know. And look, these are wonderful organizations that can keep us safe, but it is the government. We are talking about the government here. It has a hugely outsized role of public policy. I don't think that you need to look at the raid on Michael Cohen's lawyer to see that, though certainly that could alert one to a problem. I think what you have to see is agencies invalidating Trump federal policies. I think you need to see agencies saying, no, sorry, people of America, sorry, duly elected representatives, we're the benevolent betters, and we're going to tell you how to run your lives better than you can. That, to me, throws up warning flags. Perhaps, when the agencies are coming after the duly elected president, when Bill Kristol, a leader for a long time of the conservative movement, says between the Trump state, that is the elected sovereign state, and the deep state, or the bureaucracy, I choose the deep state. When you have people saying that, that is a terrifying place in the country. And so perhaps that calls our attention to it. But I am grateful for those raids if it can call people's attention to how we have to shrink that headless, godless, unaccountable bureaucracy.
You estimate, like a percentage?
Oh, I don't know. I mean, it's hard to quantify that, right? I mean, one special counsel investigation is worth quite a lot, isn't it?
Broader sense of the country as a whole, like over the past 20 years.
I think it's been growing for about a century. I think the administrative state has ballooned and ballooned. I'm sorry to say that it was Republicans who invented the income tax and the IRS. It happened with Abraham Lincoln, and it happened with William Howard Taft. But agencies have ballooned and ballooned and ballooned, and they can ruin you. They can forget even Donald Trump or the intelligence agencies or the things that kind of make splashy headlines on the internet. They can just ruin you. Dinesh D'Souza donated a little bit too much money to a state candidate, to a candidate for Senate in New York, who, by the way, was never going to win. I was working elections at the time of that race. It was just a nice thing for a friend. And Barack Obama selectively prosecuted him. The federal agencies went in there and destroyed this guy's life. You saw the IRS targeting conservatives during the Tea Party movement. You saw them targeting groups that I am a member of, they were targeting. I'm sorry that I can't give you an exact number, because one of these incidents could be far worse than 99% of them. But the simple answer is it's too much, and it has grown and crept over a century in an insidious way. And that's why it's going to take more than one man named Donald Trump to crack that, or other conservative activists. We have to be relentless in wresting our power back from the government. Good question.
Hi, thank you again so much for coming out. I wanted to ask you a little bit. I'm from Michigan, and so obviously I am very worried about my friend Tim Allen. I'm sure you know his show was canceled a couple seasons ago after six seasons. And I wanted to ask you a little bit about what your thoughts are on the future of not necessarily conservative voice, but conservative storylines being told in Hollywood and on network television. I know there's currently a lot of back and forth going on about Roseanne, but I think Tim Allen kind of fell by the wayside. You know, he had 6 seasons, and his show was about in the top third of brackets about network at the time, and it was kind of unexpectedly canceled. Mm-hmm. Just kind of your thoughts on that, what you knew about it at the time. They don't learn anything. What I can tell you just from my brief time in Hollywood is I don't think it's like someone sitting at his chair petting his cat, thinking, how can I ruin Tim Allen's life today? They're just a little dim. I think they say, okay, we're going to, whenever they make conservative art, it always is great. In fact, when they make non-leftist art, it always does really, really well, and people really, really like it. Roseanne is a good example of this. Roseanne is not a conservative. Roseanne, doesn't go to the Heritage Foundation or anything like that, but it was a non-leftist show. It's a show that shows America as it is, with all of its warts, and she says, nah, I'm voting for Trump, yeah, I really like him, and it's done very well. And even controlling for nostalgia TV or whatever, it's blown past anything else. But they keep doubling down because they're in such a little cocoon themselves. They don't know anyone who voted for Donald Trump. They don't know anyone. They don't know anyone who watches Tim Allen's show. Tim Allen's show is very, very popular. They don't know anyone who does it. It's so isolated for them, and I pity them for it. I really do. I pity us a little bit too, because it ruins our culture. But I pity them because we can see it. When a conservative is so beleaguered by the culture constantly, the popular culture, it becomes a little clearer.
what works, what doesn't work, what people want, what they don't want. But when all you do, look, Los Angeles is a driving city. On average, you see 3 people there a day. You get in your car, and then you drive to your network, and then you talk to all lefties all day long, and that's all you do. Then maybe you drive to a cocktail party, and you see exactly the same people, all of whom donated to Hillary Clinton, none of whom have ever watched Tim Allen's show, and then you drive home again, and you rinse and repeat. You just keep doing that on and on and on. I wish there were some way to show them. I thought that the high ratings for conservative art would do this. Good war movies, that show America in a good light, or television shows that break that narrative. But they seem not to get the message. They keep asking Jimmy Kimmel to host the Oscars. This year, the Oscars were down 20% over a 9-year low. They'll probably have him do it again next year. Jimmy Kimmel gave a joke-free monologue this year. There were no jokes. It was just political diatribes. But that's what they've all convinced themselves sells, because it sells with their friends. Trouble for them is it doesn't sell for the American people, and thankfully we have other venues now that might not be network television, but we can get the word out, and we can get even our art out as well.
Hi, Michael. Thanks a lot for coming. Some of the president's biggest supporters, maybe we'll call them always Trumpers, seem to have this, they subscribe to this notion of 4-dimensional chess, that, this idea that he's 5 steps ahead of everyone, and when he appears to be shooting himself in the foot politically, it's actually part of his brilliant master plan. Now, I think on your show you've said that you don't subscribe to this idea.
I think it's totally made up. I think it's a fiction invented by never-Trumpers. And I'll clarify that. I don't think that Donald Trump is playing 17-dimensional chess, and I don't know anybody who thinks that Donald Trump is playing 17-dimensional chess, and I know a lot of Donald Trump supporters. What we all think is this guy is pretty good at the media. That's what we think. That is our grand suggestion. There is one group that says he's a total dolt and an idiot and just happens to be lucky all the time, every single stage of his life, every minute of the day. And then there's another group that says he's really, really good at the media, much better, not only than other politicians, but better than the reporters and the journalists and the TV comedians and all of them. That, I think, is a perfectly obvious observation. And rather than always Trumpers, conservative supporters of the president, denying his stupidity, I think what's really happening is that the Never Trump movement made a difficult calculation, and they made the wrong calculation, and they're trying to justify it by pretending that he's a dolt when it's obvious that he isn't.
Hi, how are you? So I think you've made a very clear point that unfortunately, conservative opinions are being restricted, limited, shut down, however you want to say it, in universities, Hollywood, YouTube, Twitter. So I guess a question I'd have for you, as a frustrated conservative, where did conservatives go wrong? How come the gatekeepers are all liberal? Like, is that a question you ask yourself? Like, or do you just assume that, in Hollywood there's going to be this liberal bias, YouTube has a liberal bias? Like, why is that a thing? Clearly the content that conservative culture puts out is like really good content. So why is it always that the gatekeepers have this liberal bias?
It's because we didn't play 16D chess, and they did, to borrow from the last question. It's because we ceded the campuses to the left. It's because we ceded Hollywood to the left. We gave it up. We allowed them to take over, and so the radicals of the 1960s have become the tenured radicals and the professors of our own era. We gave it up, and in part this is because artists tend to be on the left. This is true throughout history, and as an occasional artist myself, I'll explain it. It's because artists are completely out of their minds. They're unmoored. They're allergic to getting a paycheck. They cannot wake up before 2 p.m. The song from Pinocchio is right. Hi, diddle-dee-dee, the actor life for me. You just kind of walk through life and do-do-do-do-do, and there is no responsibility, and one doesn't do conventional things. And so this appeals to lefties in a way that conservatives think like, wait, I can go to Wall Street and then make all of the money? Well, maybe I'll do that. Yeah, that sounds a little bit better than, doing some black box play on some godforsaken boulevard in Los Angeles. So I think there's a temptation in the culture to move to the left. I think also the academy, by virtue of living a purely intellectual life, a life that does not have much practical application, also attracts the left. Because, as I mentioned earlier in the remarks, conservatives tend to prefer the practical to the purely theoretical. We don't say, Who cares if it works in practice? Does it work in theory? You know, we live in time and space. We have bodies. We have a soul, we have a body, and we're a unified person. So I think both of those things tend to attract the left, and that creates culture. The intellectuals on campuses who educate the next generations create the culture, and in Hollywood, they create the popular culture, and that's exported around the world. There are excellent conservative artists. I know many of them, but there aren't that many of them, and so it's easy to sort of gang up on them, especially after a series of legal decisions during the 20th century in Hollywood that basically destroyed the studio system, took serious businessmen out of the equation, and gave the asylum to the lunatics to run free with. The same thing has happened on college campuses. At this point, I'll use my own dear old Yale as an example here. Yale has led the way in campus insanity over the last 3 years. They have been they've had Shrieking Girl yelling at professors and saying, this isn't about an intellectual space. This is about my comfort and my home. And what does the administration do? They say, oh, I'm sorry. Okay, whatever you want. Okay, that's fine, darling. It's the same thing that happened in Hollywood. We've let the lunatics run the asylum. And I think the only way to grab that back is to find those conservative intellectuals, to find those conservative artists, and using the tools that are now available to us, that are now at our disposal, that did not exist 20 years ago, blast them out to everybody and hope that conservatives aren't such Philistines that they won't watch cultural products.
Hi. I go to an all-girls school in New Jersey. I'm a junior in high school. It's an extremely liberal school, and I have friends who openly talk about how they would never talk or associate themselves with people who vote for Trump. So I was wondering how you would suggest I get my opinion out there and have a conversation in that kind of environment.
Yeah, it's a difficult, especially in high school. High school is not known for being the most reasonable place on earth, you know. It's a little cliquey and a little catty, and so you might be out of luck, unfortunately, for the near future. But you bring up a great point, which is that they'll say, I don't know anyone who voted for Trump. I won't talk to anyone who voted for Trump. I'm going to unfriend you on Facebook if you voted for Trump. And there are studies about this. Leftists unfriend conservatives and block conservatives on social media 3 times as much as conservatives do that to lefties. Jonathan Haidt studied this a few years ago, and it was even reported in the New York Times, which is that conservatives understand the left-wing point of view. Conservatives understand lefties, but lefties don't understand conservatives, because conservatives view the world in different categories, in more categories, whereas the left has a more narrow view of the world. So what I would recommend to you, a high school junior, surrounded by all of these other high school juniors, is you've got to treat those little children like children. You have to be the adult, and you have to treat them like children. I don't mean that you have to smack them around and like punch them in the face. That is not what good parents generally do. They don't like torture their kids, but they have to be a little firm. They have to be loving. They don't love their countrymen on the left. They think they're deplorable and irredeemable. But we should love our countrymen. I do love my countrymen, and I want them to do better and see the world better and have a better life. Because they look miserable all the time, don't they? They're shrieking and they're shouting and they wear those ridiculous hats and they yell profanities all the time. And when Donald Trump was elected, that woman in the video that was going around and said, no, you know, it was so delicious. I'm sorry, I'm getting distracted here. We have to do that. You need patience. You need a saintly patience, and you have to not be afraid. Unfortunately, when you have an environment that toxic, when you have a leftist culture that toxic, and that cultish, by the way, where they say, we won't associate unless you're in our group, we won't talk to you, that means you're going to lose friends. And that's sad. That's a really sad thing. But the truth above all things, and it's, you know, you're attending lectures at the University of Pennsylvania as a junior in high school, so you're probably fairly mature yourself, and I bet you can handle it.
So I'm glad you mentioned Haidt, because I think his stuff is really, and if I may just add to, what you mentioned, specifically his research is like the people on the left and the right view the world in different categories in a moral regard, right?
Right, values,
right,
yeah.
Right, and moral intuitions. And I think this was a huge, thing for me to come across, fairly recently in terms of, how I view political differences and, the extent of polarization in our country that, is obviously on display with the last election. So I think, it's pretty clear from, everything you've said, and I think just from being attuned to, the wrongdoings of the left, if you will, the kind of reactionary, well-meaning and kind of morally righteous and well-intentioned behavior of those on the left. But now, so then, what can conservatives do also? Obviously on the left, people, it'd be good if people on the left were more attuned to how conservatives think, right? And which is tough when you don't have the same moral intuitions. So what are your suggestions for both sides, basically, to fix the issue of polarization, which is, I think, generally bad for everybody?
I'll go further than moral intuitions. They're morally ignorant. There is a pervasion of moral ignorance in the West. And this is because we have an incoherent moral framework. So we talk about values, and someone says, well, I value this. And someone says, well, I value this. And I guess, well, oh, shucks, I guess we're just not even communicating with one another, are we? And it's because in the classical framework, there was a good for man. It was understood that there are the virtues, and there's virtue, and there is the good for man, and life has a purpose, and life has a coherent narrative to it. And that's all been exploded by the modern era, the last 500 years or so. So that now, it's not just that the left doesn't understand the right, or the right actually does sort of understand the left, but not perfectly. It's that we're not even talking to each other. We're using the same words, but they don't mean the same thing. We are like bar, like, roving savages or something. We're not actually having a conversation. And this is because of the shocking degree of ignorance and lack of culture. It is, I don't mean this even in a hyperbolic way. People don't read anything. And I'm not just talking about everybody. I'm not talking about, the great unwashed masses, as people deride their fellow countrymen. I'm even talking about the self-appointed elites. You can graduate from Yale University with a major in English and not read Shakespeare. Oh, yes, I graduated Yale, best English department in the country, summa cum laude. Oh, yeah, what'd you think of Hamlet? Huh? No, I didn't. No, we didn't do that one. We didn't read that. That is a horrifying thing. And so what is required there is humility. An important virtue is humility, but we don't have any humility now. We have shout, we have pride. There are all of these pride, not just for gay pride, but all of these other pride marches. We have shout your abortion. It's just various displays of yelling and of hubris. But really what is required is humility, to realize that we don't know very much, that our culture has lost something profound and important, and if we even want to be able to speak to one another, we have to recover a little bit of that, or at least understand what it is that we've lost.
We have time for two more.
Hi. So if the inevitable blue wave that we always hear about comes in 2018, do you think President Trump will end up going back to his Democrat tendencies and govern from the left, or do you think the media and the left have pushed him too far?
Well, do you think that inevitable blue wave in 2018 is going to come after the inevitable victory of Hillary Clinton in 2016? You know, that inevitable victory that a study from Princeton University said was going to happen with 99% certitude the week before the election, and then whoops, it didn't, and actually it was an electoral landslide for Donald Trump. Certainly history shows us that Democrats should retake the House, if not all of Congress, this cycle. That's just sort of what happens, and Donald Trump has a lot of forces against him. He has more opposition than your average president, so that should happen. That said, I'm not really convinced that it will, or that it'll be some wave. What they do on the left is they use the vehicles of the mainstream media that we can't get access to, and they use public opinion polls, and they use commentary to shape public opinion. They say it's inevitable. It's inevitable, Republicans. Why would you even bother going out to vote? Don't even bother. It's a waste of gas. You know, gas is expensive. Stay home, that's fine. Then we win. Then we all go out and vote, and then we win. So I'm not convinced of that premise. If the Democrats retake the Congress or something, and Donald Trump feels that he has to move more to the center to govern, I suppose that would be possible, but I don't give Democrats enough credit for that, because that would be the smartest thing they could possibly do, is to try to make a deal with Donald Trump and be nice to him and compromise and have an art of the deal. But they're just too thick for that. They just won't do it. They hate him in such a bizarre, visceral, irrational, screaming, no kind of way that I don't think they could bring themselves to do it. And moreover, I don't think their base would allow them to do it. They've ginned people up into hysteria for so long, hysteria that proved completely pointless and untrue and unfounded, and I don't think they're going to be able to pull them back to any practical governing coalition.
It's getting recorded. So.
Yeah, you might not need a mic, but I need you to have a mic.
Thanks. Oh, all right. So I was just a bit confused about the terminology that you were using earlier, and you could clarify this for me. So you talk about the left perverting culture, right? And I'm curious, and then later on you use the term our culture. So I'm curious as what you mean by our culture. Is it the West? Is it your culture? Is it the left and the rights? Is it American? I'm not sure.
We share a culture. We share a culture, and obviously some of us, look, if we're here at the University of Pennsylvania and people are wearing bow ties and we're having nice, polite conversation, that is a different culture than might be happening in downtown Detroit on some awful block right now. That's certainly true. But there are different cultures. There are local cultures and state, and it gets a little bigger. And we have a Christian culture, the Christendom or the Western culture. Certainly that's all true. The important point here is that culture and cult derive from the same word. They come from the same place. And that's because what the culture worships will define it. If a culture worships money, it will be more materialistic. If a culture worships sex, it will be a little more licentious. And our culture does both of those, and that's not bad all the time, you know, if it's a little bit in moderation, but it's clearly gone to excess. That's what I mean by our culture or national culture or whatever. There are obvious layers here. And what we have to do is decide what the culture is going to worship. Not to proselytize to you too much here at the end of this, but it's a really important cultural and philosophical point, which is that Moses asks God, he says, "Who will I tell them that you are?" And God says, "Tell them I am that I am." That God is being. You couldn't say it more simply than that. And when a culture grounds itself in the I am, Jesus says in the Gospels, before Abraham was, I am, in the present am. When the culture grounds itself in the I am, it knows who it is. And when the culture doesn't ground itself in the I am, when it divorces itself from the I am and all of the blessings that this Christian civilization has given to us, you're left only with the pathetic question, who am I? And people try on various identities, and they create different fads and passions and ideologies, and this week I'm a vegan, and this week I'm a CrossFitter, and this week, you know, I'm this, that, or the other thing. And all of those identities are unsatisfying because they're not essential. They're not from the I am. And so my word of advice for the culture writ large, my word of advice for the popular culture is hire conservatives like me to be in the movies and to write the movies. And my advice for the popular culture writ large is to look carefully at what it's worshiping and who it's worshiping. That's the only way to get it on the right track, and it's therefore the only way to get politics back on the right track.
All righty. Thank you all so much.